Good evening. Welcome to the first webinar in the Teaching Economics in Changing Times series. This webinar series will offer expert insight on economic and personal finance topics that speaks to current and future trends and issues. This webinar in particular will explore cognitive science theories and how the analysis of information processing can apply to your economics classroom and curriculum. My name is Lakeisha Higgins. I'm a coordinator of economics education and museum outreach at the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland, the Cincinnati branch. I am one of over 50 subject matter experts throughout the Federal Reserve System who serves as an education outreach arm of the Fed. Our group, representing audiences within our various regions, provides 4 main products and services. We provide professional development for pre-kindergartner through college-level educators. We provide economic literacy programs for K through 16 students. We partner with like-minded organizations to promote financial capability. And last but not least, we develop classroom-ready resources to support instruction in economics, personal finance, college and career readiness, and related courses. As you see, our collective efforts are aimed at increasing educators' ability to teach economics and personal finance while helping students in the public gain real-life skills to increase their economic literacy and financial acumen. My colleagues and I are pleased you could join us this evening as we discuss how students learn economics and how to use the science of learning in the classroom. We're also excited to offer this virtual event, part of the inaugural year of Economic Education Month. We believe that the economic way of thinking is a core skill, one that's necessary for understanding the world and making better decisions in it. Economic reasoning helps children build life skills and ultimately become better world citizens, benefiting their communities. We want all students to be exposed to economics throughout their K through 16 learning years. The purpose of Economic Education Month is to raise public awareness of economic education. It is also a time for educators to teach the lessons on economics, encourage youth to better understand their world through an economic lens, and to inspire students to consider further study and careers in the field of economics. In today's program, we have brought national experts together to discuss and share the cognitive science behind teaching and learning economics. You will also have the opportunity to interact with them, so please prepare your questions. Before we begin exploring today's topic, let me first share our disclaimer. The views and perspectives of those speaking today are their own and do not represent the Federal Reserve System. So, having said that, today's session will include 2 brief presentations and a moderated discussion with open forum for your questions. Excuse me. Please submit your questions using the Q&A button, using the All Panels option, not that chat feature. Okay, now, let's introduce our presenters. Today's first speaker is Dr. William Goff, is a teacher professor in the economics department at Penn State. He is an associate editor of the Journal of Economic Education and a past member of the American Economic Association's Committee on Economic Education. He has published in the Journal of Economic Education, the Journal of Economic Perspective, and the Journal of Econometrics. Our second speaker this evening is Dr. Scott Simpkins, Chair of the Department of Economics at the Willie A. Deese College of Business and Economics at North Carolina A&T State University, the largest HBCU in the country. He earned his PhD at the University of Iowa and his BS in economics at St. John's University in Minnesota. At A&T, Scott has been a faculty member in the economics department and served for 12 years as the inaugural director of the university's Teaching and Learning Center before becoming chair of the Department of Economics in fall of 2017. He has led multiple U.S. National Science Foundation supported projects, and his research has appeared in a variety of academic journals and books. Scott has been a frequent presenter on discipline-based educational research topics regionally, nationally, and internationally. He is also a member of the National Leadership Team for the Accelerated Systemic Change Network, ASCN, focus on driving systemic change in higher education with an emphasis on STEM education. Today's panel moderator will be my colleague, Dr. Rebecca Chambers. Rebecca is an economic education specialist at the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. Prior to joining the Fed, she was a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Economic Education and Entrepreneurship, CEEE, at the University of Delaware. Her academic research in the areas of economic and financial literacy have appeared in the American Economist, Eastern Economic Journal, Journal of Financial Counseling and Planning, and Perspectives on Economic Education Research. From 2016 to 2019, Rebecca was a faculty in the Department of Education at Michigan State University. In 2012 and in 2013, she completed economic education internships at the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. Rebecca earned a BA in economics from Wells College, a MA in economics, and a PhD in economic education, both from the University of Delaware. We are in for a treat. So now I'll turn it over to Rebecca.
Thank you very much, Lakeisha, and welcome everyone to tonight's program. As Lakeisha mentioned, I'm Rebecca Chambers from the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. Before we get started with our speakers tonight, we have two polling questions that we'd like to ask you. We'll go ahead and launch these two polling questions to ask you about what level do you teach, or if you are a student, and then how familiar you are with cognitive science. As you're answering both of those poll questions, please choose your answer and then click on Submit at the bottom of the poll panel. Now let's go ahead and see the results in a few seconds. We'll let a few people answer last minute. It looks like majority of you teach at the high school level, with then the second most being teaching at the college level, and a few students here. Welcome to all of you. And it looks like most of us are, not all that familiar with cognitive science. Some of us are somewhat familiar, but hopefully we will learn a little bit more tonight. And that's what we are going to do right now. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Bill Goff, who's going to start our presentations today. Go ahead, Bill.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Let me get my presentation started here. And Bill Goff, I teach economics here at Penn State, teaching specialist, if you will. And my talk is very much like what I actually give my students on study methods they might be using to study in their own classes. They're very applicable at pretty much any level. So I think they'll work very well for our audience today. I want to start off with a poll. And this is something I would have my students do. I'll give you 60 seconds to count the vowels in these words, starting now. The poll should not be going yet. Another 15 seconds, count the vowels in these words. Five more seconds. And that's it. Now I have a question for you, the poll. How many words do you remember? So if we get the poll going now. Okay. Poll is concluded. And let me see here. Not seeing the poll results, but typically what I see when I teach this is most people would answer 0 to 3 or 4 to 6 words. Let's try this a little bit different way next. Again, this is exactly what I'd be doing in class. Here's the same words. My question for you now is, how are these words arranged? There's a certain pattern to these words. I'll give you 60 seconds to do that task. Then we'll have another poll following this 60 seconds. So starting now. Add another 30 seconds. What are these words arranged by? Ten more seconds. 5. And that's it. The second question then, how many words do you remember now? Our second poll, if you will. Again, I'm not seeing the poll results. It's the only thing I did not practice before the presentation. But what I typically see in class, and I've done this demo a number of times, very good. So many more words recorded the second time than the first. And again, this is a demo I do in class. I'll show you the source here in a moment. And it's getting the following idea. Both tasks were given the same amount of time, but the second time you remembered many more words than you did the first time. Same amount of time, so what's the difference then? Well, the method is a little bit better aligned with the task. The first task, counting vowels, doesn't really help you remember the words. It wasn't aligned very well, if you will. Another way to think of this is the first task was kind of shallow, something just counting vowels, something very straightforward. Second task was deeper to understand the pattern of the words. And you look at the words, going back here very briefly, the pattern is quite obvious. Something that has one attached to it with 2, 3, 4, all the way up to something attached with 15. A phrase I like very much from the cognitive scientist Dan Willingham, memory is the residue of thought. You thought more about the same words a second time, and you remembered many more of those words. In short, this is a demo again I do with class, how you study matters. You can spend the same time and do different things. And for sure, when you're studying economics, you're not studying word lists like this, but the principle certainly holds. What you do, how you study matters quite a lot. And the more you think about the thing in line with this cognitive science quote, it matters quite a bit. The source on this demo is Teach Students How to Learn from McGuire and McGuire. I won't mention this book more tonight, but it is a useful source to have overall. I have several other sources at the end here. When I think about the challenges we face in studying in high school And in college, the academic demands, the students are pretty much thrown into the pool. They're told to study, they're told to put in time, but exactly what that time should be is not too well defined oftentimes, at least at the college level and perhaps at the high school level as well. Here's a poll I give my students. I won't be giving you today, but it has a very interesting result. I'll let you read it there. And this comes from Sandra McGuire as well. And almost always, the vast majority of students answer B, learning something well enough to teach it, as opposed to getting an A. This goes like 5% for A for my students and 95% for topic B. And that's going to be the heart of study suggestions, but a little bit more first. You might be familiar with Bloom's taxonomy, especially if you teach at the high school level, the idea of how to orient or structure different sorts of learning students might do. At the bottom is basic facts, the current unemployment rate. Next would be to be able to understand or explain how that is calculated. Perhaps next level up, apply, calculate a new data set, and maybe analyze the pros and cons of the current measure of unemployment, and finally create something we typically don't do at our levels of teaching. So I described the Bloom's taxonomy to students. Then I asked the following question to them, same setup there. I asked them, which of these do they study for? My students tend to orient around B, to understand things. Then I next asked them, where are most of your courses? And they tend to be more towards C. I point out, that seems a bit of a misalignment there, discontinuity, not quite agreeing there. You're not quite studying for the level that you say most courses are taught at. So it gets them thinking a bit, what can I do differently? Then I point out for future jobs, for work that they're all very concerned about, you're probably at the create or evaluate level. You better practice that now to be successful in that future career. Talk about studying itself. Students have to do an awful lot of reading. One method is known as SQ3R. You can find various web entries on that. Many students haven't had much instruction how to read for academic purposes. They might think it's like a novel. You don't want to get to the end and find the surprise ending. Well, academic reading is nothing like that. SQ3R, you first survey what you're reading. You look through it. You look at the headings, the subheadings, the charts, the tables, and so forth. Much like Lindsey Vonn before she downhill skis at 60 or 80 miles an hour, you want to know where you're going. You then form questions for economics, maybe what's this elasticity thing? What's GDP talking about? I've never heard of that. Why does this supply and demand graph have these odd curves to it? You form these questions, so when you're reading, you can answer those questions. It primes your reading. Then you actually read. Every paragraph or so, you recite what you just learned in your own words, and then for sections of pages, you would then review the material. This should take some effort. The cognitive science phrase here is desirable difficulties. If your studying is really easy, it's really not an effective study method. It needs to take some effort, much like this fellow jogging. Not something like wind sprints, it's really difficult, but something that is a bit of a challenge, something that takes some effort. There's an abundance of evidence that just rereading and highlighting are not very effective study methods. This has been studied in labs and with students repeatedly, and rereading is just plain not a very effective method, but students do it an awful lot. Say students have a quiz or exam to study for, use that earlier question. They pretty much said earlier, preparing your teaching material is an effective study method, but here we tell them exactly how to do that. You need some undivided attention. We don't multitask well. I've got a demo for that, but not be doing that today. For material they need to read, the SQ3R method. and then ask them to put their materials away, not to reread, but can they explain the concepts? Can they explain how to do an own price elasticity? Can they explain how to move a supplier demand curve? How to explain the concepts in GDP? Can they explain connections between ideas and concepts? Can they describe how an own price elasticity is similar and different from an income elasticity? How supply curves are similar, but also different from demand curves? And can they connect the ideas across all the ways we represent those things with charts, graphs, and equations? And if not, when they're studying, they learn something useful. I point out, when do you want to find out you can't do something? When you're studying or when you're taking that exam or quiz? Other things that can help them learn: take practice quizzes. We often provide those, but students can make up their own. And it helps us space out your studying over days. Of course, easier said than done, but it is really true. And again, this idea of desirable difficulties, much like this jogger running at a moderate pace, these things take some effort. They're not impossibly hard. They're not terribly strenuous, but they do take some effort. To wrap up for today then, the references, one is this paper by John Danilowski. It's a summary of a huge study he and other cognitive scientists did, including Dan Willingham, who I quoted earlier. They looked at tons of studies on how students learn best by studying, and what they found is this: the most effective methods are retrieval practice, putting your stuff away, and trying to remember, taking practice quizzes, or spreading your studying out over time. Distributing it is a technical term. Other methods are very effective with a lot of promise. Interleaving is mixing up your problem types. Don't do all price elasticities, then income elasticities. Don't do all supply shifts, demand shifts. You want to mix them up, so you have to think about what type of problem you're doing next. Elaborate, explain to yourself, and self-explanations. What is not effective is rereading, highlighting, and summarizing. Huge amount of evidence on this. Another resource, this will be what the resources provided for talk today, from a group called the Learning Scientists. They looked at the same evidence. They found retrieval practice effective, putting your book away, can I explain it, spacing things out, interleaving, mixing up your problem types, elaboration, additional type here, concrete examples, where you connect to things you know, and dual coding, explaining different representations. That does it for my part today. Next, we'll be moving on to other ideas.
Thank you very much, Bill. I think these are things very important to keep in mind as we are helping our students to learn economics. And particularly, I relate to the prepare to teach the material concept, because one of my introductory, I believe it was my introductory macro professor in college, actually told me that as a study skill. And that's something that I've passed on to many students as well. So hopefully we can all learn and teach our students to prepare to teach the material. So thank you very much for your comments. Next, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Scott Simpkins. Scott, take it away.
Good evening, everybody. I see a number of people on here that I know, so welcome. Thank you for spending part of your either late afternoon, West Coast time, evening, or somewhere entirely different time to time. I see we have some international folks on here as well. Thank you all for being part of this. Let me say at the beginning of this part, we'll have a resource list, and you'll see mine. We'll have a number of references. You don't need to write them down. That will get mailed out later. I'm actually making some changes to that, so in the next day or two. And let me just tell you, I teach macroeconomics. I teach at both the intro and intermediate level. I'm teaching intermediate right now. So my point about that is the kinds of things we'll talk about are relevant for both beginning students as well as students who may be juniors or seniors as undergraduates. So again, I'm at university. I'm at North Carolina A&T State University. and Lakeisha introduced that very well in an HBCU kind of way, historically Black College University, largest in the country, yes. So I'm in Greensboro, North Carolina. So thank you again for being here. There we go. So the last 20 years, I've brought lots of different resources about the cognitive sciences at the hands of all of you, all of us, in terms of trying to bring together both the research on learning and the practice of teaching, right? So you see a whole string of them. This is just a subset of books that are available to you, but some that I'll make reference to. It started out with Really How People Learn back in 2000, and looking at probably 30 years worth of cognitive science and the most robust results, and then moving forward to a whole series, an explosion really of books on this. So the question, and I'll come back to this at the very end, there's so much stuff out there, like where do you even start? Where do we begin, right? So I'll come back to that. And so Bill was talking about things that were largely student focused, right? In particular, studying. There are a variety of other, you mentioned the learning sciences. I'll come back to that. I'll talk about how I use that actually in my class. It's a video series by Stephen Chu, and then there's a piece in the Journal of Economic Education. And again, these references will be available in a separate email that you'll get with these resources, right? And how to really help students learn better, in particular on their own in terms of their studying process. I'm gonna focus on the teaching part of this and thinking about creating research-informed activities and learning environments that promote effective teaching. And these are just a few of those resources on that first page that really focus on that. How can we take what we're learning about cognitive science and apply that in the classroom or online? So just a couple things I want to say about active learning. Some of you know about this. This is a classic study about active learning, and it's helped to make the point strongly. It's been referenced many times that you'll see with A or B here in terms of failure rates in this case, right? You see a larger group, a larger group of students or a larger group of studies where the failure rate was decreased significantly, or in the graph in B there in the lower right, the number of students who failed classes is significantly less overall with active learning than sort of peer lecture. There's some controversy about this study, and people have raised issues about it, but it's really been, the focus is about active learning, and you have a definition up there, right, about engaging students in the learning process, right? Meaningful activities, thinking about what they're doing. My argument here is all active learning is not alike, but that the cognitive sciences and learning sciences can help us structure active learning in ways that help improve student learning in a more systematic kind of way. So learning, right? So the big nerdy picture here, right, is about making connections, firing neurons. It's about students changing their brains. We can't learn for students. Students have to do that. So we provide the environment to help them build synapses, fire neurons, and link them, right? Barbara Oakley and her colleagues call it learn it and link it, right? And it's all about encoding, consolidating what we learn, right? Moving it from short-term memory into long-term memory, and then being able to retrieve it fluidly, especially in new and novel situations. That's really the holy grail, transfer. That's really hard. If this was Bloom's taxonomy, that would be at the top of the cognitive list, the cognitive science list. But what we want to be able to do is help students encode information, consolidate it in different ways, and then be able to retrieve it. And that's really what learning is all about from the cognitive science side. And so these are some key ideas. I'm just going to use these. We could use, there's a much longer list that we could cull from many of those references that I had in the very first slide. Bill has talked about some of these already in terms of distributed or spaced practice and interleaving. these are the 6 that are laid out in this book, Understanding How We Learn. It's got a nice, relatively short piece. Some of you may know about this, have this. Again, this will be in the reference list. It's one that we used in work around team-based learning in a set of articles that are out in the Journal of Economic Education right now, and applying the cognitive sciences and learning sciences to that, and how it informs team-based learning. Okay, so I'm going to come back to these 6 in some examples. I'm going to move from theory, right, the theory part of this, to, because what you want to know is like, well, okay, that's great. So we have to do a little bit of theory, but we want to think about, well, what does that mean in my day-to-day life in the classroom? And so this is, I'm going to give you some individual strategies. And again, this is just really an introduction. I'm going to give you some places to go look further. In the Q&A, you can ask questions as well for some deeper background on this. Just-in-time teaching was something that was developed initially in physics. And it's giving questions to students ahead of time. You see their responses. They'll do it online. You'll see the responses prior to class, and their responses inform what you do in class. So you might have students respond to a set of questions. Again, it's what the questions are, how you structure the questions to get at perhaps misconceptions that you know about in economics that students have, and to elicit those through the questions, and be able to then sort of get into their brain prior to class, and then use those responses to structure what happens in class, let's say the next day, the next morning. So it's something I use in my class, and I'll say more about how that happens in my class in a bit. Clicker questions, many of you probably use those. Peer instruction, that's really the key part. I was just talking with a faculty member in our department. I'm the department chair here at North Carolina A&T this morning about peer instruction. And there are useful resources about how to think about how to use clicker questions, how to use peer instruction, that is students turning to one another, right, to answer it, first of all answering on their own, then turning to another student, and how to use that method to increase student learning and to be most effective using that strategy in class. It's not just a matter of doing clicker questions. It's what kind of questions do you ask, and how do you structure the process. All right. Some more individual strategies, in other words, just individual things that one could do in a class. This comes out of the team-based learning literature. I know that Mark Mayer's on here, and others that we have worked together on team-based learning, finishing up a National Science Foundation grant related to that currently, and have some articles currently in the Journal of Economic Education and a symposium on team-based learning. So these application exercises are, and I'll skip over to the table 2 that actually comes out of one of those Journal of Economic Education pieces, right? It's a brief question and has 4 or 5 specific responses, right? All students have the same problem. It's a significant problem. This is the 4S framework from the left. There's a specific choice that each team has to make, and then the teams all simultaneously report. And then they have to defend their team answer. So there's some facilitation at the end. So these kinds of things, along with peer instruction, along with just-in-time teaching, right? They're all aimed at retrieval practice. They all help with, in this case, concrete examples, perhaps getting at misconceptions, elaboration, a really important, as one of them Bill listed, tool for students to learn. They're all aimed at these cognitive science principles, but these are the pragmatic practices in class that are informed by those principles. Bill mentioned the 6 strategies for effective learning from the learning scientists. There are 6 of these in these little posters here. Learn how to study using space practice, retrieval practice. I actually use these in my class. I use them as a just-in-time teaching exercise, and students have to pick one of the 6 early on in the course, tell me about how they're going to use that during the course. After the first exam, I ask them how that worked and what changes they're going to make, or if it worked really well, why it worked well. So it's getting them to be metacognitive about their own learning. some of you may know about these scratch-off forms. They're if-at forms, immediate feedback assessment techniques, and they're quizzes that are done in teams. And the right answer is under one of these. You scratch them off like a lottery ticket, and you get differential points. 4 points if you get on the first scratch, 2 on the second, etc. And so it provides sort of a game-like collaboration, and it gets people really engaged. And they have to elaborate and convince each other which one is the correct answer for a particular quiz question. And then there's a reveal, and then sometimes you don't have the right answer. And you can see like number 5 here, like that none of them got that one right. But it really, really is helpful. It's a team-based kind of quiz. And it builds collaboration skills as well, and retrieval practice and elaboration, all of those cognitive science principles. A couple of that I want to finish with here, and these are to think about applying these principles not for individual kinds of activities, but course design strategies. This is actually what's down in the lower right. When I started using team-based learning, or a version of team-based learning in my Principles of Economics course, a few years ago, after I'd been teaching Learning Center director and then came back to the department, my students were having trouble understanding how everything fit together in the course. And so that grid is actually an attempt, for me to really make sense of that, and for them to make sense of it. And you can see that there are different course components down that second column. The top half is really a formative assessment, then there's evaluation, summative assessment at the bottom. You can see that the Bloom's taxonomy builds. So it's building and showing them how the different things that we're doing in the course, it's structured, it fits together, there's a purpose behind it, and it builds to take them higher to higher levels on Bloom's taxonomy. There's a piece there, Getting Under the Hood, by Eddy and Hogan, that showed when you increase structure in courses, it really helps the students who perhaps bring the least preparation or least background about studying, for example, into the course, underrepresented groups, and a variety of others, first-generation students. It has a differential impact. Helps everyone, but it especially helps those students. Team-based learning. This is a whole course structure, and the paper that is referenced here, it's just current this summer. Really, there are 6 different kinds of strategies that we show that really undergird team-based learning, or team-based learning is informed by these cognitive science kind of principles: spacing, distributed practice, effortful retrieval, concrete examples, etc. Right? So again, it's thinking about how you might structure a whole course, and how you might implement these kinds of strategies throughout a course. So let me finish by saying, like, so okay, that's a lot, Scott. And like, that's just the tip of the iceberg, right? But so where would you even start with this? I actually like Stephen Chu and William Serban's piece that's in the Journal of Economic Education, and they start with cognitive challenges that students face. And then the question is, in our teaching, how do we help students address them? And what I have down in the lower left are some teaching methods. What I had this up on the screen before. A starting point site is a site that Mark Mayer, Marie McGoldrick, and I developed with a different NSF grant, and has 17 different kinds of teaching methods that are evidence-based, many of them which apply these cognitive principles. So there are a whole set of really in-depth resources there, and that's free to use. So I'm going to stop there so we can get to questions and get to Q&A. Yeah, I look forward to hearing from everybody.
Thank you very much, Scott. You really gave us a lot of things to think about, and a lot of resources that we could use in our classrooms, and ways to think about how to incorporate many of these things. So thank you so much for that. We're going to now transition to a discussion with both Bill and Scott. As a reminder, if you have any questions for either of our speakers today, please submit your questions in the Q&A using the Q&A button, and using the all panelists option so that we can see them. So to start with today, many of you mentioned, or both of you mentioned, very specific practices that you can either use with your students or you can use within your classroom. So if you had to choose your top 1 or 2 that instructors could use very soon without a lot of prep, what might they be? And we can start with Bill.
Sure. I would probably have not done these things before. What you might start with is a so-called minute paper, where at the end of class, you have students write down what they found most confusing for that day. Then you can start off next class with that very topic. You'll probably be a bit surprised on what they found confusing. Students think differently than we do, and that'd be a nice, easy introduction to some of these ideas.
For me, the one that when I have up there is one I started with, actually, is just-in-time teaching. It was, it's a really valuable, it's been a really valuable tool for me, partly for the reasons that Bill was just talking about, for eliciting and uncovering students' thinking. It's a way to get in their brain, in essence. Depends how you ask the questions, like everything. That's why I started at the beginning. The cognitive science principles help to think about how we structure active learning activities. All active learning activities are not the same. So the kinds of questions, if you think carefully about questions to ask students that get at potential misconceptions or show their thinking process, those are things that you can then help students address, you can address, but you can also help students address in the next class in real time, not with a lag, not after the class, but before the class.
Those are great suggestions, and I like that we can use those in the classroom right away too. That's wonderful. So Scott, you had mentioned something about active learning, and particularly throughout the pandemic, many have switched to either online or hybrid teaching now. Some are back in person. Hopefully we'll all be back in person sometime soon. But in thinking about this transition to both online and hybrid teaching, how can we use some of these strategies, particularly around active learning, in an online or a hybrid setting? And we can start with you, Scott, this time.
So I'm not going to lie. This is a big challenge. I'll tell a quick story. When we made the pivot to online learning in March of 2020, here within a week, we didn't have like a break week like many of you did. I tried to maintain similarity with what I was doing in class with teams. They're permanent teams throughout a semester. And it was just too much at the time. There was too much going on cognitively, like there was just too much going on for everybody, right? So I've moved away from that in my online courses, but there are ways to do these things asynchronously. One could collect those JIT, just-in-time teaching responses, and then bring them back out and use them, for example, to seed a discussion board. And so a favorite just-in-time teaching question might be, okay, you get the responses, and what would I do with them in an in-person class? I would take a selection, I would take a sample of those responses that highlight particular thought processes that maybe a variety of students have, right? They represent buckets of thoughts that students have that might not be quite right, but have some kernel of rightness about them. And I might have a multiple choice question for students in class, for teams, and say, so which one of these responses is the best and why? And have A, B, C, D, right? So one could do that and translate that, for example, to a discussion board and get some responses and get some discussion going asynchronously before one then maybe wraps up a couple days later. Maybe you come in and help to consolidate some of those questions. So that's one example. But you know, it's really difficult. So I'd like to hear from the people that the 81 of you that are on here how you've done that, because it's hard. So this is an opportunity for other people to share as well. Yeah.
Bill, do you have any suggestions on how we can incorporate active learning using some of these cognitive science strategies within an online or hybrid framework?
Worksheets might be one way to do this. I think that'd be fairly straightforward for a transition or bridge for a lot of people. We all use homeworks of various sorts, and you could use worksheets to do that. You can actually do a worksheet in Google Docs. You can create a presentation, a little bit easier in presentation side rather than Google, than a Word document. And with one version of the project or whatever you want them to do for different students, then you can easily glance through it. I'm glad to share more overall with you if you like with that.
Great, those are great suggestions. So we have a question from the audience getting at they're saying different quality students or maybe different abilities. So if you're thinking about a classroom or a lecture hall, you typically have, the excellent students, you have some middle of the road, and then unfortunately you have the lower ability or the not as excited to be there. So how can you kind of teach to the different ability students? Do you try to aim high? Do you aim low? Do you aim in the middle? What are your suggestions? And we can start with Bill on this one.
I tend to aim toward the middle. That's a tough one. I don't have a great answer to that. I would say for testing, what you can do is have a sufficient number of questions that your less capable students can answer, and then a smaller number of questions to differentiate your students. So at least your exams look, quote, normal or whatever. Also depends a bit upon institutional goals. Is retention an issue or not? Oftentimes those lower tier students, they would really benefit from a more structured sort of environment. There's papers by Eddie and Kelly Hogan on that in biology education. So I might look for Hogan and Eddie structure, Google that, and they've found that more structure in a course where you do more small assignments does really help those less capable students. So that would help you somewhat, I think.
Absolutely.
That's the one I had mentioned earlier, and it will be in the reference list. I see the question there about share the books mentioned. Yes, it'll be in a resource list. Everything that was in our slides will in terms of that will be in a resource list. It may not. I'm updating that actually currently. So it'll be there in a day or two. This bimodal distribution is something we face here at A&T a lot. So my response to that would be team-based learning, using teams, even if you don't do a whole course, but using teams. This is responding to another question. Those are permanent teams, not random. The question wasn't whether they were permanent or not, but do we assign the teams? Yes. Are they based on something about the students? Yes. But they're not, you could do it behind the scenes, and you could have some information about their SAT scores or their whatever, but that's not, I don't think that's actually really useful and good. I'd like to make that very transparent. So we do it in class, we do a lineup, and then we figure out how many in a team, and we do a lineup, but it could be, I want to make sure that they're male and female representation. So I will have all the males together and then all the females. And then within that, I might say, has anybody had a previous economics course? Because we don't have prereqs for that, but you could use other things as well. And what happens is you're going to get, if it really is bimodal like that, you're going to get some mix of good and bad, rewind that, right? You're going to get some mix of students who are high performers and students who may not perform as well for whatever reasons, for a variety of reasons, right? And that working in those teams and having activities that are structured in ways where the high performing students and the low performing students they can't answer all the questions. They need everybody there to answer them. It actually works particularly well, and it helps to build community where they can then form study groups outside of course class as well. So yeah, it's a tough situation, but you need to bring them together. You can't have them, in my view, you can't have them working in separate groups, right?
Yeah, it sounds like team-based learning it might be a good strategy to combat some of that. So with that, kind of a follow-up question to that, in your experience, and then also looking at, how cognitive science thinks about these things, will students, if properly motivated, rise to an instructor's expectations, or is there a student preparation constraint that the instructor just cannot overcome? What is your experience, and then what kind of does cognitive science maybe say about this?
Many of these strategies, if you start reading about them, they're aimed at getting students prepared prior to class. So one of the things that is behind retrieval practice is the testing effect. Lots written about that. So, I used to not be too keen necessarily about having quizzes at the beginning of class kind of thing. But yes, actually that can be a particularly useful thing. I like the just-in-time teaching. The scratch-off form quizzes that I was talking about. Students actually do them individually the night before, or maybe even up to an hour before class online. And they take the same exact quiz as a team in class, and they get the average of the two scores. They should get 100% in class. So that tends to build motivation for students coming to class. being prepared for class, there's a direct bonus for that. Does it solve the problem? No, but you do enough things like that, and you bring, if you bring the work that they've done into class, just-in-time teaching responses that they've done, and they aren't just sitting out there, but you're actually using them in class, the more you can do that kind of thing, the more that students will engage and be engaged in class, and the more you can make things interesting, concrete examples, make it things that are relevant to their lives. All those things have been shown to increase engagement as well. But no, none of them are. I'm dealing with some serious issues. I think it's a hangover of COVID and being unstructured for a year and a half. And I'm dealing with some, many of you are right now as well. But it's a real challenge for me right now this semester because I don't feel like students are at the same level of engagement. Yeah.
Yes, I think we can all agree there's a different level of motivation than maybe pre-pandemic. Bill, what do you think about this idea of motivating students? Is there a constraint that we can't overcome? Can some of these strategies help students? It sounds like maybe if we get a little bit more buy-in from our students, whether that be team-based learning, whether that be more just-in-time strategies, it seems to be that maybe we can motivate it. What's your thoughts on this?
Well, I think they can be motivated. I mean, there's some we can nudge. There's some that it's very hard to. There's some that come all set. But sometimes asking good question is very motivating on why is this occurring. You might have testimonies from previous students who had a challenge in the course and then succeeded, maybe a video testimonial, or maybe just something text-based, so it's not quite so public that you might do. So it is a bit of a challenge for sure. But questions that go to the heart of puzzles, testimonies from previous students, might be two ways you could motivate them a little bit.
Those are great suggestions. And I do like the idea of just trying to get them to buy in, again, with the caveat that it's very challenging right now. So maybe eventually our students will buy in a little bit more. We do have, sorry, go ahead.
Quickly, in active learning, you might ask the first day class, what do you hope to get out of college? Is it facts or is it how to think? They'll probably say how to think. It's like, well, that's what we ought to be practicing. You have them then.
Yeah, I like that. So thinking about that transition to college, we have many people who are high school teachers on tonight. And one of the things that we are asked frequently as economic educators is how can we help teachers, or how can teachers best prepare students for college learning? So thinking about this through the cognitive science lens, what can some high school teachers properly do to help students for either if their post-secondary option is college or if it's entering the job market? What skills can we impart on our students? We can start with Bill this time.
Sure. What you might do, again, I really like these testimonials. You might have had a successful student, a senior or junior in high school, then a few years later they're in college. You might have them come back and talk to the class, do a video or something like that describing challenges they face. It's been a long time for me. I remember my challenges, but some time back, it's colored through the years. But a recent student probably has better advice than we can supply to them. And in today's world, they're pretty easy to find on social media, and they'd probably be honored to come back and talk to your class for a bit, or maybe you could do TikTok or Snapchat or some other sort of social media example for them.
Yeah, I think that there's just a lot to cover in high school courses, in high school curricula, end of grade tests, right? If you're doing an AP exam, if you're teaching AP economics, for example, a lot of that is, maybe not at the highest level, Bloom's taxonomy in some sense, perhaps. And so trying the move from high school to college, I think the biggest challenge that we see is the depth of understanding. And so helping students think about things conceptually, not as pieces, not as individual pieces, to chunk them together. This is the learning sciences part, right? Because we can't remember all the little pieces, right? All the little stuff. But if you can get the big ideas, right, about the economy, that I'm a macroeconomist. So I want students in my intermediate macro class, and juniors and seniors, right, to say, look, we are talking about 3 things in this course, really. We're talking about long run growth, right? What determines living standards, at least from a material sense anyway? And then fluctuations around that, right? Business cycles, like what causes that? And then what can policy do to help us kind of try to either increase that long run growth path or stay close to it? And then there are other things, there are specifics underneath that, but this is the learning sciences part, right? We can't keep all that stuff in our minds, but if we can create schema, that's another little buzz phrase, right? Think of graphic organizers, right? And how things fit together. Then there's some hope of like being able to see where individual new knowledge gets hooked onto existing knowledge. But that's another cognitive science principle. The students will have more durable learning if they can hook onto something that they already have a framework for. So developing the framework as opposed to just developing the things, right?
Yeah, that sounds wonderful. So high school teachers, we are challenging you to think about this and help prepare your students for post-secondary options. So to end with our last question here, I would kind of like your elevator pitch for why we should use cognitive science in the econ classroom. So why do we want to think about cognitive science in teaching and learning economics? And either of you can start.
I'll start, I guess. I find these methods much more fun to teach with. You see the light bulbs go off. You see where students have difficulty. There was an example earlier in the Q&A about change in demand versus change in quantity demand. Personally, I think that nomenclature is awful. We should have better terms for that. No wonder they're confused, but it is what it is. But developing questions that get to the heart of the misunderstanding, I mentioned Q&A, that's the fun part of my job. I don't like writing tests, don't like giving them, don't like dealing with students unhappy, but crafting questions get to the heart of a misunderstanding. That's just the funnest thing. And that is really my pitch for that.
Yeah, I agree. A plus one to Bill's comment there, right? And yeah, it's much more interesting. I don't. There's some didactic instruction, but I don't lecture on PowerPoint says what happens in my class, and so students I think have more fun too. Although it's harder, it's a higher level of learning, but I think at the end they're more satisfied with what they learned because they're more likely to remember the big ideas. And because you've done it in a structured way that helps to first of all I'll go back and create the synapses, right? Fire the neurons, create the synapse, help them fire the neurons and create the synapses, and to create durable learning. And if you've created an environment in which that can happen, they can see the relevance of it, right? And so if we can connect that to the relevance, they're going to find more satisfaction as well, and they'll be more motivated to come to class, to learn, to take additional courses, etc. So we do need to pay attention to the context for who we're teaching, who's in our courses, right? Economics has a long history of that. We're making headway on that, right? In terms of underrepresented minorities in economics anyway, right? In terms of gender, in terms of race and ethnicity. So paying attention to that, I think matters as well. That's part of the cognitive sciences as well in terms of the motivation side, in terms of the relevance side. There are just lots of different principles here, but I think it's more fun for students as well because they can see that, they can feel the learning going on. It's not just an exercise.
Well, fantastic answers. I think you've convinced a lot of people tonight. Thank you very much to both of you for sharing all of your expertise on this topic. I'm going to turn it over to Lakeisha to end us out for the evening.
Thank you, Rebecca. In closing, I would like to extend our thanks to our speakers for sharing their expertise and insight on this relevant and timely topic. I would also like to thank my colleague, Rebecca, for moderating and guiding our discussion. We know that life is about choices and economics plays a big part in it. So thank you for choosing to spend your evening with us.